Welcome, I'm Giulia.
And I am Marta.
And this is Late Mode, a podcast in search of the zeitgeist. Through a series of conversations, we explore the fragmented and hyper-connected modes of our current times. Welcome! In this episode, I sat down with Tobias Winkels to chat about all things trees. Grown in Germany and currently based in Prague, Toby is fond of trees and other refuge of wilderness. As an arborist and tree climber, he is currently focused on fostering habitat structures serving biodiversity in both natural and man-made landscapes. In our conversation, we explored different definitions of economy, while this concept made us think about the moral implications of using nature as a role model. Hi, Toby.
Hi, Giulia.
Thank you for agreeing. I know it's something maybe a bit new for you to record the podcast. Also with the topic of today, which I thought was quite tricky. We already had a little bit of a chat together on how do you talk about economy, which is the topic that Rosie left us. She really specified economy and not the economy. Yeah, I'm interested to see how you will see it in relation to what you do, which is studying arboristics. I think that not many people know what this actually entails. So maybe you can start by describing it.
Yeah, I'm very used to describing this. Nobody really knows about this profession. It's a subject that deals with the management of urban green generally, and mostly urban trees. Arbor is Latin for tree, and it's about implementing trees in the best way possible in planning cities and taking care of cities, that they are a well-working part of our urban environment where these days most of the people of the planet actually live in.
We were together just 10 days ago in Másiš in Czech Republic, and I saw you climbing some trees there and cutting some branches, and it was very nice. It looked very dangerous to me, to be honest. But it was nice to see you sort of in your element. So we did this field research that was interdisciplinary approach to this place of Másiš, and you decided to focus on something that you called deadwood. And when we were having our talk about this podcast, I thought it was very interesting how this term, deadwood, might relate to this topic of economy that we might explore today. So maybe first you can talk a little bit about the Deadwood project.
Yeah, it was not only about deadwood, but also about ancient trees. And both deadwood structures, especially those of a bigger diameter, and also ancient trees that grow very thick and have a lot of cavities and complex structures. They both things that barely appear in our forests anymore, especially the economical forest, like the productive forests. Their aim is to produce wood. Of course, you have also aims of ecological kind, but first and foremost, it's about productivity. And deadwood, these ancient, quirky trees, they're not productive. They're not really usable in economy, so that's why they're not part of it. Trees get taken out of the woods at a youth age where they have the right size to process them for building, etc.
So if I understand it correctly, you were trying to give a purpose to this wood that normally we don't consider it useful. So your idea in Másiš was to create these habitats with it?
Yeah, my main aim was to raise awareness of this topic. Because the purpose of deadwood and these ancient trees, it's always been a big part of forest ecosystems that is very crucial for habitats of various kind of insects and birds and mushrooms, and a lot of food chains. Key elements actually rely on these structures that are not very present anymore in our forests. So if we want to have a proper biodiversity in our forests, we have to find a way to make deadwood and ancient trees a part of that.
Okay, and you would see that only in forests or also in cities, because you mostly work in cities, right?
Yeah, I think it's also very relevant in cities, especially in people's gardens. It's a small thing everyone who has control over a garden can do.
For example, keeping parts of trees, but is it only trees or is it also bushes? Or
When a tree gets sick, for example, or when a tree becomes less vital, it's not a reason to cut it down completely necessarily. You always have to think about that it has to be safe, that it doesn't fall over and damage things or people. But often you can find a way of pruning or dealing with a tree without removing it completely. There's also ways of cultivating trees that they will develop these structures that I was talking about more quickly, like some tree species that grow very fast. And then when you prune them a lot again and again, the mushrooms will get in and decompose the wood, and you can have structures that often take decades to develop in nature. You can try to cultivate them within years.
so this is something that would help in general with biodiversities in cities and in forests and sort of contribute to a betterment of the larger ecosystem, right?
Yeah, I think most important is the larger scale production forests. But I believe that our gardens can be a kind of a role model, or can be a
point of departure.
A point of departure. And also I think it's good when you do in your private smaller dimensions, when you act according to the things you believe in are right. So that the gardens, or maybe even little forests, or the areas you maintain, I think it's important that they reflect what is important in nature.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think in our previous chat, when I informed you of the topic of today that Rosie left us, we were both of us actually thinking, but how do you talk about economy when it just feels like it's this huge thing out of your control? And I mentioned that for me, yeah, the individual is very important in this picture. And I really like what you just said. So what you do sort of reflecting exactly what you believe in. And this is something that we can only do as individuals, basically. And then when we come out of ourselves and we become part of groups, then obviously we can bring that voice into the group. And yeah, actually, I did something a bit silly this morning when I was thinking about the podcast, and I was thinking about economy and this huge word, how to do it. So I basically went on Google, as we usually do when we want to find some inspiration, and I was like, okay, how is economy defined as
I did the same thing the other day, actually.
And what did you find, actually?
Well, it's a system that is organized in a way to serve the needs of people, but I think you can also implement the needs of other life forms in that.
That's a really nice definition. I think I wanted to really see how the Wikipedia definition would be like, and I went and found out there's a careful management of available resources, and somewhat, I don't know, I really like this word careful, even though when we think of economy right now, carefulness doesn't really come to mind. So I really loved how Wikipedia had this really hopeful definition of economy. And is it actually careful, as in caring for all these different life forms together in this system? Or does it mean that from a human perspective, we're just, bringing these systems together to our needs, as in we're caring for ourselves? And how do you see this participation and this collaboration of human and what we consider nature and trees in this case?
I met a lot of people in this subject, in this profession, who care about it in a very good way, who are very careful about this topic. But I also see a lot of carelessness in this regard. In cities, it's often about numbers of trees. Okay, we have so many trees, but then they cut down all the old trees because they are high maintenance, and they plant new young ones who have just a very little impact and serve the climate and the ecology, etc., way less than an old tree does. And it takes a lot of centuries for them to grow that old. So there I see a lot of carelessness, that the old trees, again, become less and less in the cities.
So then again, this goes back to what was your definition that you found out of economy?
It was a system that its purpose is to serve the needs of the community.
So
I think that was the German Wikipedia.
Interesting, very interesting already.
So
this point.
There was no carefulness in there.
No care. But I guess then if we would think of cutting down the trees, for example, the need is the safety, so then that is done. So I guess this makes me think that economy is much more about defining what are the needs to then see how can a system work for these needs and maybe also in a caring way.
I was just thinking, because you talked about that carefulness implies also other life forms. And I think it's also a lot about that carefulness implies a perspective for the future, also for ourselves, because a lot of the things that are done now, they not only disregard the fundamentals of living for other life forms, but also disregard future generations. So I think these are the two main kinds of carelessness that are a big problem in an economy.
Yeah, I found it so fascinating just hearing you talk about trees. I mean, in our own conversations, well, when you really think about how old trees can be, how they survive and regenerate and cooperate with each other, especially the survival and the regeneration part of how trees can adapt and sort of cure themselves in a way. Well, with some help, of course. Maybe you should explain it a little bit before I say something that is not my field.
Yeah, I think the way that trees grow and the way they deal with wounds, with trauma, it's very different to what we know from our bodies, like physically. They don't heal wounds like we do, but they compensate with further growth, and they stop the wound from getting bigger, but like any wound will always stay part of the tree. I often look to trees when I think about how to deal with a situation, or like with a certain experience I've made or a certain problem I have. I don't remember really having many like human role models in my life, but ever since I deal with trees more, I often just think of how trees deal with certain kinds of things. And even though they physically grow in a very different way and have a different mode of living than we do physically, I see a lot of parallels of how we grow as people to how a tree grows, how they have this consistency of growth. You never really see them do things, but they continuously grow, and every part of the tree grows at the same time, and there's a part of the tree that will dominate in growth, and other trees are proportionately growing with it. And when there's a trauma, they have strategies to stop the wound from getting too big, and then they will compensate with further growth and keep that wound within them and live with it for the rest of their lives. And the oldest trees, they are full of cavities, and they've survived a lot of lightning, a lot of huge parts of the crown that will break off due to wind, or a lot of decay induced by mushrooms. They deal with attacks and traumas in that way, like all the time, a lot, and they're able to just keep going.
And when you say that you see the parallel, do you see it more to a tree to an individual, or a tree to like a society or a community?
Yeah, the different trees, of course, have very different characteristics, have very different ways of adapting to certain circumstances. That's also where I think it's a role model for how a society should work. A biodiversity means that the organisms have their niche they are well adapted to, and they have these structures that they need and that they are made for.
So they kind of keep their own individuality, but then they still kind of can express it in a way together in this system because it kind of works with each other.
Yeah, and I mean, they're all the same, basically. They all need water, light, and they grow. And,
like us.
And get offspring and stuff. But then they're so different in their strategies how to get there. And there are the species which go to new places where no tree is yet, and they are adapted to this open space, and they prepare the soil, and they deal with the direct sun and the winds that are on an open field, and they are very well adapted to that. Then there are other trees which can only thrive in the shadow of trees that are already existing on a soil that is already prepared by other trees. There's all these very different strategies, and then Also on an individual level, a tree of the same species can look so different in different circumstances. They adapt very well to the place where they are. I mean, they cannot go anywhere else. So.
But actually, when you were talking to me a little bit briefly about how trees reproduce and all the different strategies that they have with seeds flying in a certain way, or how many seeds they would produce and then release, and I thought it was so fascinating. So yeah, they cannot move, but definitely they have a lot of strategies in place to maintain their survival. I mean, just hearing you talk about this makes me think that only if we would describe economy according to how trees actually intertwine with each other would already be a good definition, I think. It has a lot of parallels to systems, and also they seem to care, like they need to care about their offsprings, so they care about how they're reproducing, but at the same time they also have to care about all these other organisms that are also supporting them, right? So if they would do nothing for the mushrooms, let's say, then they would also suffer from it. I think that's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to be careful with taking nature as a role model. Like I pick and choose, and I think you have the whole spectrum of what I consider very, very good and very morally good. But then you also have the equivalent of greed and cruelty and egocentrism in nature too. So, for example, the example you were talking about with the mushrooms and the trees, there's this symbiosis called mycorrhiza, where a mushroom will grow on the roots of the tree, and it is much better than the tree's roots are at taking up nutrients, like important micronutrients from the soil, and it will supply these nutrients to the tree. And the tree will share the energy it gets from the sun through photosynthesis with the mushroom, so it can grow. So it will feed the mushroom in order to get those nutrients, basically. That's a very well working symbiosis that has been on Earth ever since trees existed, pretty much.
But you can see this in a negative way?
Yes, and it can actually turn bad. So it happens that at some point, maybe because the tree is not very vital anymore, or somehow the dynamics change, it can happen that the mushroom will at some point start invading the tree and basically eat it up and kill it. So it's a Darwinist nature, right? They try to get their fair share, but then you could say it in a way that if they don't see the profit anymore in the symbiosis, they can turn to parasites and they will just eat the organism up that they've been collaborating with for many centuries. So that's not really something that would be a role model for me.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this is what we already deal with in our own human economy. Right now, I'm mostly thinking about the economy, which is what Rosie had told us not to discuss. But I guess you would hear it maybe in the podcast that I recorded with her. But she was like, okay, it has to be economy, not the economy. And then immediately I thought, okay, because when we think of the economy is immediately associated to money and to capitalism, or, liberalism and other forms of organizing monetary exchanges. And maybe she was interested in us discussing something broader than that. But I think it's inevitable, actually, to think about the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also much more interested in economy when you put it like that the core and the origin of the word and the purpose of it is just about supplying the elements of a system with what they need. And this is working in the global economy of us humans these days on a scale and in a complexity that is unfathomable, I don't know. And it brings a lot of pros and cons with it, and nobody really understands it. And this is very hard to talk about this, but economy originally, is something super crucial, super important. Of course, like it's fundamental to any corporation, any sustaining of life.
Yeah. To go back to what you were talking before, there is no point in denying also how it turns sometimes to this.
A majority of species actually on the world are parasites. So it's maybe the most successful strategy in nature is actually just feeding off other organisms' energy and damaging them by doing so.
And how do you see that? Like, do you see it as something, well, you already mentioned you see it maybe in a negative way?
I don't see it in a negative way at all.
No.
I see that this is just part of the world, a necessary part of the world, and that I still, of course, have my beliefs in what is right and wrong, and I don't say like, okay, all these parasites and they're natural, so I might as well. I just think that in nature, the whole spectrum of human morals is represented as well. I think it's just part of the world, that what we consider evil is very much at the core of what constitutes the world. I don't think it's something to get rid of. It's something to fight against. It's something to be careful about. But it's nothing to get rid of.
So this would be your sort of problem with taking nature, for example, as a model of our own economies. Then how would you integrate nature within this definition of economy?
I just pick and choose my role models in nature.
Nice.
I think there's just things that work really well in nature in a parallel way to what I consider good and beautiful for human life and human cooperation. I think the love, care and help and awareness and humility, it's all...
And resilience also.
And resilience and braveness and all these virtues that I hold very dear. I also see them in nature, and those are maybe the role models that I follow.
Yeah, I like this idea of pick and choosing. I mean, I guess, again, to draw a parallel to, for example, our structures and our ways of organizing ourselves, I don't think that all of them are bad. I think there is a lot of good things that also went into this idea. Even the most economical idea of economy was not all bad in principle, that many things turned maybe into what we were saying before, exploitation and greed, but a lot of things were done also through collaboration and also through this desire of leaving something for the generations after, and many things were not even so thought through. I think it would be interesting for us to mention how we got this topic of economy from Rosie, because I think it's an interesting point. We started from dissociation was our topic, and through our conversation we got to economy. So by discussing how things were sort of scattered everywhere, and she used to work for Greenpeace, so in a way it's related to what we have been discussing today. And she found how this institutionalized context of Greenpeace sort of brought her away from this interest that she had in ecology and activism and climate activism, etc. And then by the end of the conversation, actually, she was interested in finding out how other people, in this case you, think of economy, so of systems. And I find it quite interesting how also in our chat now we have scattered ourselves, right? To talk a little bit about nature, a little bit about money. But actually, I think that this, in fact, is what comprises, this topic of economy. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that in my profession and in my subject, I'm dealing with the everyday environment of actually most people living on this earth. I think one major reason why it is important to manage trees, manage plant life and wildlife and biodiversity also in cities is that I think it's good when our living environment reflects what we consider good ecology. And that when we have trees that serve their purpose in a similar way they do in a natural environment, and when you have all those habitats and all those biodiversity features that exist in a natural environment, when you also have it in your garden, when you have it in your parks and your cities, I guess it associates you with these ecological matters more when you actually have it around you, and you also feel more happy living in an environment that is closer or more similar to nature and also can inhabit other life forms and not only humans.
So in cities, for example, and this brings me to, how did you get into this actually? Like, how does one become interested in arboristics? Is this something that you always wanted to do, or?
No, I had no idea this exists at all until maybe 4 to 5 years ago. I always liked being around trees a lot, and I liked to climb trees a lot in my youth. So
So the climbing part was already there.
was already there, yeah. I mean, it was all already there, like the whole passion and the identification and the connection to the trees. It was always there. I never knew there was a career to approach in that way. So yeah, the original motivation was just that I felt like I finally found a way of being useful and working in a way that is fun for me and useful for the society and meaningful in some way, and that I can actually take part in economy in a way that is meaningful and that also suits my talents and my ideas of a good life.
Yeah, that's really great that you were able to find this space. And I think it's quite fitting also to the topic of economy, precisely what you do with your life, like day to day, like your profession. It has to be embedded into this economy of services, for example.
Yeah, and I think it's better when these two things that are often considered opposites, nature and civilization, when you try to bring them together more, that it's not just concrete and steel and, totally urban cities, and then in other parts you have, for example, national parks where no human is allowed inside and where you let nature play out freely, which is very important. But I don't think it's a good thing when this is separated so much, especially for our well-being as humans. It's very important that we have the plants around, we have the trees around, we have biodiversity of some sort around, which is actually surprisingly large. I found out the biodiversity of cities already is much bigger than I thought. There's a lot of structures that occur in cities, like on walls, on construction sites, on torn down buildings, on ruins that some plant, some of them coming from the other side of the world, find their niche in and spread out. And it's like city ecology is actually a very interesting and broad subject as well. So to meet the major problems of biodiversity and of the extinction event that is currently happening and caused by humans, it's mainly important to protect and manage the more natural environments in a proper way. So the cities will never be able to be diverse ecosystems of that kind that you would have outside of a city.
So you're saying that in cities you will need a certain level of intervention to make them this place of good ecological diversity. I guess if there would be no intervention at all, then maybe a lot more plants would just grow everywhere.
Well, I think that mostly in cities, to a lot of people, plants are... When they decide about constructions and about using space in a productive way in the city where the space is very limited, often many people would just not have plants in them at all and remove the plants that naturally occur there because they are in the way of things and stuff. So I think you have to be proactive supporting plant life and a general biodiversity in cities. But the point I want to make is that I don't see so much the meaning of my work in saving biodiversity by managing cities well. The space for this is much more in the ecosystems outside of cities. But what in cities is important to me, that we have these aspects of natural life in the cities, because life is just much better when you have trees around. And it's an anthropocentric approach that I have here. But I think the right place for humans is amongst plants, amongst animals, and not in a concrete desert.
Actually, this makes me think of what we were talking about earlier, this place for individual action and caring for the natural environment from an individual standpoint. I guess if you are surrounded by more plants, by more trees, if you actively, for instance, do something in your garden, what you were describing before, by default, you connect yourself much more.
Yeah, this is exactly what I mean. I think when people grow up in a city where there's barely any plants, no animals except maybe pigeons and mice around, then they don't identify with nature and with aspects of ecology and biodiversity. I think it is important that it is a direct and immediate part of the everyday life of people.
Do you see yourself promoting this outside, like your colleagues, for example?
Yeah. I have conversations, of course, in my whole peer group and my social environment about this, and I make very clear what I think is good and what not. And also with the customers I have who I take care of trees for, because I mainly work for private people, not so much for the cities yet. I always try to convince them of the importance of, for example, the deadwood and ancient tree structures they can support in different ways, that they do not get rid of their deadwood, but, for example, build a deadwood hedge or just a pile of deadwood where the wood can be inhabited by insects and birds and also mammals and hedgehogs, etc., where the wood can decompose to form humus and to better the soil and support new plant life growing in the garden. And also to install feeding stations for birds, for example, because it's very important that the birds are dying big time. So it's important to meet all those aspects. And I try to, whenever I'm in a position to influence someone to make some decisions that serve biodiversity, and that,
It sounds to me then, going back to Wikipedia's definition of economy, it sounds like you're taking this carefulness towards the resources available. So this makes me think that maybe, when we think of like economy as this huge topic, as we were saying at the beginning, something outside of our hands, in the end is not so much outside of our hands, like we are participating in it every day, maybe also with things that we don't even realize. Like what you just mentioned, I think is super important. Like how do we expand, okay, you working with your colleagues, you're studying with your professors, but then you go out into the world and start talking to people and make them sort of more aware of things that maybe they weren't thinking so much about. For instance, I never knew anything about that wood. Like already this for me was a crazy surprise. And also what you're saying in cities, to look at what is growing there. It's something that I've started doing, much more relating to photography and to finding out what kind of plants I can use to make natural dyes, natural prints, and etc. But then you kind of open up this whole big topic, and then you become more interested, and then you become more connected to it.
Yeah, and it's one of the parts that I enjoy the most about my work, that I usually build up real relationships with the customers that I work for regularly. I also spend time with them outside of my working hours at times, and I take time to consult them and to have conversations with them and to raise awareness. And as we talked about, if you raise awareness for a topic, then you also raise a care of that topic. And it's a very minor scale impact that I have this way, but I think it's some impact in the right direction.
Well, I mean, it's what you can do, right?
Yeah. I could become an activist and try to change things on a bigger scale where it matters even more. But I'm not at that point now.
Do you want to become an activist, actually?
For now, I'm at a point where I'm starting my career right now, and I feel like I know very little about my subject and I have very little experience yet. I want to work on becoming a real experienced professional. I can potentially see myself at some point looking out or reaching out for certain institutions where I could get involved to have some impact of the right kind, because I think that's what matters even more than the small things that the individuals can do, which I think are very important to stay connected to these issues and and for your own well-being and your own
well, it's obviously
moral integrity.
It's interconnected,
and it's also some impact you have in the right direction. You know, every ancient tree you have in your garden where a lot of organisms can live in is a really great contribution to biodiversity. Yeah. But the real urgent problems, they have to be dealt with on a bigger scale.
So this is where you see your career maybe moving forward. I know that you're about to begin an internship in Prague, where you would actually work for a bigger institution, right?
Yeah, it's the Praha Lesy, like the city institution, which is taking care of the forest and the trees and the parks of Prague. And they have a team of arborists, which is in charge of the city-owned trees. So definitely that is something I want to experience, what I want to dive into. Also the administrative side of it works. Yeah. And I think that's already some much larger impact you have there when you actually impact the planning of parks and the maintenance of parks and the planning of alleys. And
at the same time, not forgetting to talk to people anyway about it. I think that's something you can always do. But yeah, I really loved this chat.
I also do.
Yeah. And I guess we really covered a lot of different angles, starting from the point of being like, what do we say of economy? Like, we can't even begin talking about it. I think we did approach it in many different ways, even comparing ourselves to trees, which is, of course, what you do when you have an arborist sitting down with you. But is there something that came to mind while we were chatting, like new insights into this one topic?
Yeah, I think talking about it, I realized more of what my role is in this subject of mine. I never really thought so much about how my profession works in regards to economy. I thought for a long time that I don't really have a proper place career-wise in economy until I found arboristics. I always thought like, oh, why do you always have to make money with something? And I didn't find really my thing. And I thought of economy as this necessary, maybe not evil, but this necessary, annoying part of life that you somehow have to take part in to exist. But now, I was just happy to make myself useful in economy in a way that is meaningful to me. But to think about it, how it actually relates to the bigger issues of economy, and I include the challenges of the climate crisis and of the extinction crisis and the ecological problems. I include this in economy, and I think it gave me a lot of orientation talking with you about how my work actually relates to this. And it made me think of how important the people's connection to these issues in their everyday experience is, and that I can actually play a very good part in this.
I mean, I'm
very happy that you gave me this kind of orientation right now. It's cool.
I'm happy that I could give this to you, and I'm also very happy of what you in return gave to me on this chat. I was really happy somehow to think of this parallel of us and nature and how to really think of it. And now I have to ask you a very important question. So we know our system on the podcast where we leave a topic for our next guest, and maybe you can take some time and think of what you would like someone else to be discussing for our next episode. We call it a ruin, basically taking a piece of this conversation, process it, and then sort of come up with another topic to be discussed.
I recently had a talk with a friend, and he told me something I wasn't aware of before, which is that the word humility actually has its root in the word humus, and that humus and humility come from the same root in etymology. Yeah, well, we're talking about the nature, how it can be a role model or not, and how virtues and also evil has its roots in nature, its roots in the humus of nature. And we also talked about the responsibility maybe that everybody has, or the things everybody can do to be connected to the issues. And I feel like humility is really a great virtue that is very important these days, and that also supports being careful and aware. I think humility also means something else to different people, and I would be curious just on another person's perspective on what humility means to him or her, how it maybe connects to the challenges of our lives.
Yeah, I wonder what it means, as in, like, you know, humus provides these nutrients, this like feeding part of the soil. Yeah, if that's connected to humility, maybe that tells us something about how we should approach maybe things if we want them to grow and to prosper and to kind of, you know, take direction. And I'm also very curious. It's a really nice topic. And thank you so much for today. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, or otherwise we say goodbye.
No, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I feel honored that you consider me
it's a small
a
podcast.
worthwhile partner for this conversation. And
yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your time.
I love that.
Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you want to dive deeper into the show, don't forget to check the podcast description for extra resources, contact information, and a sign-up form for our newsletter. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.